You're watching Phantom Astronaut, and in this video we're exploring the darkest caving disasters on record. If you're new to the channel, remember to like and subscribe. And now, let's journey deep into the Earth with our first story. Into the Abyss. Caves of death and dark secrets. Caves have always embodied a paradox of wonder and terror. By day, their cathedral-like chambers and glittering mineral formations inspire awe. By night, their yawning mouths dissolve into blackness, hinting at unfathomable depths. For those who venture far beneath the Earth's crust, the boundary between adventure and nightmare can be perilously thin. In the silent, Stygian darkness, a single misstep or a sudden twist of nature can turn a subterranean paradise into a tomb of stone. This chapter explores some of the worst cave disasters ever recorded. Real historical tragedies where exploration met with catastrophe. Each story unfolds in an eerie underworld, illuminated only by flickering headlamps and fading hope. Through survivor testimonies and forensic reconstructions, we relive these harrowing events in detail. From underground floods and collapsing rock to deadly human misjudgments, these accounts are as compelling as they are disturbing, designed to instill a mix of fear and morbid curiosity in the reader. In these deep places, the line between life and death is drawn in dripping water and brittle limestone, and as these tales show, that line can be crossed in an instant. Yet, for all their darkness, these stories are not mere ghost tales. They are rooted in fact, each one scrupulously documented in the annals of caving history. We will journey from the dank hollows of Kentucky to the underwater caves of South Africa, from the windswept moors of Yorkshire to the lush rainforests of Thailand, all to witness how dreams of discovery turned into fights for survival. In 5 of the world's most haunting cave disasters, we encounter both the folly and bravery of humans who dare to go where sunlight never reaches. Each case is presented with rich narrative detail, blending the visceral impressions of those who were there with the scientific and technical explanations of what went so horribly wrong. As you read, remember that every name and location cited is real, every quote comes from a voice that echoed in the dark, and every outcome, however tragic, has been faithfully preserved in the historical record. The lights on your helmet are flickering. The air is thin and cold. Take a deep breath and steel your nerves. We're going down into the abyss where a single sound, perhaps the drip of water or the distant rumble of rock, might be the only warning before disaster strikes. Trapped in the twilight, the saga of Floyd Collins. In the winter of 1925, a lone lantern's glow trembled against the damp walls of a Kentucky cave, marking the presence of an explorer who had ventured deeper than anyone should dare. William Floyd Collins, a 37-year-old veteran caver, wriggled through the bowels of Sand Cave with an almost routine confidence. For weeks, he had been excavating this cramped limestone passage, convinced it might lead to a spectacular cavern he could open as a tourist attraction. It was the era of the Great Cave Wars, when prospectors in central Kentucky fiercely competed to discover and commercialize underground wonders. Floyd Collins was determined to find his fortune below ground, even if it meant inching through muddy tunnels barely wider than his shoulders. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, Collins hung his coat on a boulder, lit his kerosene lamp, and slipped into the earth one more time. He did not know it yet, but he was embarking on what would become one of the most famous and fearsome cave ordeals in American history. Not long after entering Sand Cave, Floyd encountered the first in a series of tortuously tight squeezes. With practiced technique, he exhaled fully to flatten his chest, pressed his arms to his sides, and snaked through an opening less than 8 inches high. The cave's walls pressed in on him as he descended a sloping chute and belly crawled through an uneven fissure strewn with loose rocks. Collins was no stranger to such confines. Friends joked that the wiry explorer seemed part mole, and he navigated each pinch in the passage with patient care. Deeper and deeper he went, through twists and drops, until he arrived at a small cubbyhole above a vertical shaft. The lamp's flame quivered in the stale air as Collins looped his rope around a rock and rappelled down into darkness. At the bottom, his boots splashed into a shallow pool. For a moment, the cave rewarded him. He found himself in a larger chamber roughly 60 feet deep, which he eagerly began to explore by the amber light of his lamp. Stalactites glistened overhead and the air smelled of wet earth. A typical Kentucky cave, alive with promise. Collins had a hunch he might be on the verge of a great discovery, but fate intervened with a cruel stroke. As Floyd Collins probed a narrow crawlway on his return route, disaster struck in the most mundane way. Crawling headfirst back up the tight passage, he inadvertently dislodged a rock the size of a heavy sack of grain, approximately 27 pounds. In the blink of an eye, that stone dropped and pinned Collins' left ankle, twisting his foot and wedging it solidly against the wall. The passageway was so narrow that Floyd could barely move, let alone free his leg. He struggled mightily, skinning his arms and burying himself deeper in loose gravel, but the rock held fast. Within minutes, what had been an easy crawl became a stone vise gripping his body. Collins was trapped 55 feet below ground, in a horizontal shaft hardly wider than a coffin. The darkness pressed on him as his kerosene lamp began to sputter. When the flame finally died, Floyd Collins was left in absolute blackness, caught in a stone straitjacket, as one account would describe it. Unknown to him at that desperate moment, it would be 17 days before anyone would reach his position again, and by then, it would be far too late. For the first few hours, Floyd Collins faced his predicament alone. He shouted for help, his voice absorbed by the maze of tunnels above. Eventually, friends and family realized he was overdue, and a search party found him the next day, still alive but hopelessly stuck in Sand Cave's tight belly. Thus began a rescue effort that would explode into a national media frenzy and test the limits of engineering and endurance. Rescuers made their way down to Floyd through the tortuous path he had crawled, bringing him food, coffee, and reassuring words in the pitch dark. Among the first to reach him was a diminutive Louisville reporter named William Skeets Miller, whose small stature allowed him to slither closer than most. With great difficulty, Miller managed to wriggle into Floyd's cramped cell and became both confidant and lifeline to the trapped man. The image of the journalist lying prone in mud to interview a man half buried in rock captured the public's imagination. Through Miller's dispatches, the world heard Floyd Collins' voice echoing up from underground, and that voice was remarkably calm and courageous given the nightmare he was living. By the light of a flickering electric bulb that rescuers had managed to lower to him, Floyd described his ordeal in a quavering but resolute voice. "I have faced death before. It doesn't frighten me, but it is so long. Oh God, be merciful," he implored, as Miller later reported. In the damp gloom, Collins spoke of his faith and the odd comfort he found, knowing that so many people were trying to help him. "Tell them I'm not going to give up. I'll keep fighting," he insisted to the reporter, who scribbled notes in the darkness. These poignant quotes ran in newspapers nationwide, turning Floyd Collins into a household name overnight. From New York to California, front-page headlines carried updates on the cave tragedy in Kentucky. Thousands of onlookers flocked to the remote cave site, creating a carnival-like scene of vendors, gawkers, and journalists. The Kentucky National Guard was called in to control the crowds and maintain order. It was one of the first rescue operations to be broadcast live on new technology, radio, which riveted millions who hung on every bulletin from Sand Cave. Even the U.S. president kept tabs on the situation, and congressmen paused their debates in Washington to ask for the latest news from Kentucky. In the words of one observer, it became the most gripping story since the assassination of a governor, a true nationwide cliffhanger. Meanwhile, deep underground, the rescue operation struggled against the unforgiving realities of geology. Traditional methods failed. The tunnel to reach Floyd was simply too narrow and unstable. At one point, a rope and pulley system was attached to Collins, but each tug caused him to scream in agony as the angle threatened to break his leg. Worse, a collapse in the cave on February 4th sealed off the passage, cutting off direct access to Floyd beyond mere voice contact. The decision was made to dig a new rescue shaft down from above the cave, essentially a vertical well, 55 feet deep through solid limestone, aimed at reaching the trapped man from another angle. Engineers and miners were summoned. Day and night for over a week, teams labored with pickaxes, shovels, and dynamite to sink a shaft into the frozen ground. The work was backbreaking and perilous. Twice, the walls of the shaft collapsed, sending rubble dangerously close to Collins. The bitter winter cold seeped into the ground. Rainwater trickled into the shaft, turning it into a mud pit. Above, onlookers warmed their hands on bonfires and peered anxiously at the excavation. Below, Floyd lay shivering, singing hymns to stay sane and clinging to the hope Miller had kindled in him, that salvation was near. During those interminable days, Floyd Collins oscillated between hope and despair. In one heart-wrenching exchange, he told Skeets Miller of the hallucinations that came to him in the silence. He heard music in the cave, a phantom orchestra playing an old hymn. Perhaps it was delirium, or perhaps the acoustic trick of wind passing through limestone channels. Either way, it underscored the razor's edge between reality and dream in that black hollow. Collins spoke of how he had cheated death before in previous close calls underground, but now, it's so long, he lamented, fearing this time death would not pass him by. The reporter himself confessed later that he had to steel himself against the horror of the situation, a man slowly dying inches from him, beyond help. We all felt like sitting down right there and crying, remembered Lieutenant Burden, a National Guard officer who aided one failed attempt to lift the crushing rock off Floyd's foot. They had brought a crowbar and a small jack into the tunnel, and in a torturous contortion, Miller tried to lever the boulder off the pinned ankle while lying atop Collins. Each effort lasted hours in the wet, constricted space. Collins encouraged, "Keep turning, fella. It's coming off," when he felt the rock shift slightly. But each time, the improvised apparatus slipped, or the rescuer's strength gave out before the stone could be pried free. After one such attempt, Miller emerged from the shaft, ribs bruised and muscles quivering, and openly wept from exhaustion and frustration. Finally, on February 16, 1925, 18 days after Floyd Collins had been caught in the grip of Sand Cave, the rescue shaft broke through into the tunnel below. Miners carefully widened an opening and at long last reached the small alcove where Collins lay. But the scene that greeted them dashed any remaining hopes. Floyd Collins was lifeless. He had succumbed to the elements and thirst roughly 3 days earlier, according to estimates, dying alone in the dark from exposure and starvation. A physician on the scene concluded that hypothermia and exhaustion had quietly claimed him around February 13th. By the time rescuers finally reached his side, Floyd's body was cold and his once clear eyes were shut forever. The man who had survived for 2 weeks between life and death, inspiring an entire nation to hold its breath, was gone. The tragic end sent shockwaves through the crowds above. Many wept openly when word spread that the cave hero had died without ever seeing the sun again. Out of respect and the very real risk of trying to extract the corpse through the narrow tunnel, officials decided to leave Floyd's body in place for the time being, effectively buried in the cave that killed him. Sand Cave's entrance was sealed with a makeshift gate as a reverent hush fell over Cave City. His remains would actually not be recovered until April, when better equipment and stabilized walls allowed retrieval. The aftermath was a mixture of somber mourning and circus-like spectacle. In the months and years following, Floyd Collins's tragic tale took on a life of its own. His body, once recovered, bizarrely went on display in a glass-topped coffin at a nearby cave attraction, a decision by his family that later backfired when the corpse was briefly stolen by looters, a grim epilogue to an already macabre story. He was eventually laid to rest in a proper grave, his tombstone inscribed, "Greatest Cave Explorer Ever Known." Beyond the lurid fascination, Floyd Collins' death had important repercussions. Public outcry over the incident, and the exploitative carnival that grew around it. contributed to the push for greater protection of Kentucky's caves. In 1941, largely spurred by the awareness raised from events like Collins's saga, Mammoth Cave and surrounding caves were designated as a national park. No longer would cave owners be able to dangerously commercialize or compete over the labyrinthine underground at the expense of safety and preservation. In a way, Floyd's forlorn sacrifice was not in vain. His story, dramatized in books, songs, and even a Broadway musical, endures as a cautionary tale about human ambition and the unforgiving nature of the underground world. The image of him trapped in Sand Cave's cold grip, singing "Nearer, My God," into the emptiness to keep his spirits up, remains one of the most haunting in caving lore. Today, visitors to Mammoth Cave National Park sometimes hike to the now sealed Sand Cave entrance. There, a historical marker quietly recounts Floyd's fate, and one cannot help but feel a chill. Peering into the shadowy maw of the cave, you imagine a lonely lantern light flickering somewhere far below, and a voice rising faintly, as if from the depths of the earth itself. Drowned in darkness, the Mossdale Cavern flood. On a midsummer day in 1967, 6 young men crawled into the bowels of Mossdale Caverns in the Yorkshire Dales, England, and never crawled back out. What transpired in those twisting passages on June 24, 1967, remains the deadliest caving disaster in British history. It is a tale as chilling as the waters that claimed those explorers' lives. Mossdale is not a cave for the faint-hearted. Even in dry conditions, it was known as a super severe system, a labyrinth of low-wet tunnels that demanded extreme endurance. Fewer people had seen its farthest reaches than had walked on the moon, cavers like to boast. That Saturday, the 6 men, all experienced members of a university caving club, ventured hours deep into Mossdale's remotest sections, hoping to discover new passages. They joked and bantered as they went, undaunted by the tight squeezes and frigid streamway that snaked through the caverns. Summer sunlight was a distant memory behind them. Ahead lay only the cold embrace of limestone, and an insidious danger that every caver fears: rising water. Mossdale Caverns is essentially an underground river course. A stream called Mossdale Beck disappears into the cave's entrance and re-emerges miles away, meaning that heavy rain can turn the cave into a submerged conduit in a flash. Cavers knew the rule: never be inside during a downpour. But June 24th began as a pleasant day, and the eager group had no warning of the thunderstorm that would unload hours later. By the time distant thunder rumbled across the moors above, the team had already crawled beyond features ominously named Drown or Glory, a set of water-filled squeezes, and navigated passageways like Rough Crawl and Knee Wrecker Hall. Each name on the cave map foreshadowed the physical punishment of Mossdale. Finally, they reached the infamous 900-foot marathon crawl, a nearly flat-out belly tunnel half filled with water and mud. One by one, the men slithered through this oppressive crawl space, chin deep in the stream, their helmet lamps scraping the ceiling. It took them to a region known as Far Marathon, further from the entrance than any other place in the system. It was there, hours into the cave, that the nightmare began. As the 6 cavers pushed into a remote section seeking unexplored leads, someone remarked about a sound, a low rumble, like distant thunder or an oncoming train. "Hey, what's that rumbling? Not the stream going up?" one of them quipped nervously. Instantly, everyone fell silent. The only sound was the fast-rising gurgle of water around their bodies. Their hearts jumped. It was every caver's worst fear materializing in real time. Unmistakably, the gentle stream was swelling into a torrent. Within moments, a gale-like wind, caused by water surging through constricted passages, blasted past them, and the current at their elbows picked up strength. These men knew Mossdale's reputation. No one had tested just how completely it could flood, but the lore suggested that in a major rain, the entire cave might fill to the ceiling. Now they faced that horrifying prospect, 2 miles inside the earth. They did not panic at first. They were among Britain's best cavers, young and strong, aged 17 to 26. Surely, they thought, it couldn't happen to them. But as water continued rising inch by inch, soaking their prone bodies, the awful reality set in. There was nowhere to escape to. The only way out was back through miles of flooded crawlways that were quickly becoming impassable. Lying flat, contorted in a narrow tunnel with a rock ceiling inches above, they could do nothing but instinctively wriggle faster downslope, hoping to outrun the flood. Water was now splashing over their faces. The roar became deafening. In those final moments, the 6 cavers were united by terror, inch by rising inch, as the flood waters chased them. Soon, the space between water and roof shrank to nothing. The cave would be their tomb. Above ground, the tragedy announced itself in subtle ways. 4 other members of the caving party had actually turned back earlier that day, exiting the cave before the marathon crawl. One of them, a young woman named Morag, trudged back to the entrance around the time the storm hit. To her shock, she found Mossdale Beck transformed into a raging brown river, and the cave's only entrance was now a submerged hole, choked with water and debris. She immediately realized the dire situation of her 6 friends still inside. Rain pelted the limestone crag as she ran 4 kilometers across the moor to the nearest farm, raising the alarm with a phone call that mobilized local rescuers. By 11:10 p.m. that night, the Upper Wharfdale Fell rescue team had assembled at Mossdale Scar. What they found was horrifying. Mossdale Caverns had essentially become an underground lake. The normally dry shake hole at the entrance was overflowing. Water gushed into every crack. Veteran cave rescuers who arrived peered into the flooded hole and shook their heads. They had performed dozens of cave rescues, but Mossdale was different. A notoriously tight and extensive system for which no blueprint existed on how to conduct a rescue in such conditions. Many feared that anyone caught deep inside during a flood would stand no chance. Still, they refused to abandon hope. As one rescuer grimly noted, cavers rescue each other. No one else can. Thus, scores of cavers from across northern England converged to help, while heavy rain continued through the night. The rescue operation was epic in scale and courage. First, the flood had to be tamed. Volunteers furiously dug a trench to divert Mossdale Beck away from the cave's mouth. The deluge was so intense that it took until the next day for water levels to drop enough to permit entry. At first light, teams plunged into the cave, trudging through thick mud and pushing against residual currents. Among them was caver Tony Waltham, who led the vanguard down the long marathon crawls toward where he hoped to find survivors. Conditions inside were surreal. The normally echoing chambers were deathly quiet. It seemed like the silence of the grave, one rescuer said later, describing the eerie stillness once the flood subsided. The path to the far marathon was arduous. The rescue team had to belly through 900 feet of 10-inch high crawlway, unable to pass each other if they encountered anyone, living or dead, on the way. They carried lights and first aid, praying to find at least someone alive in an air pocket beyond the sumps. Their hopes initially soared when they discovered 5 of the 6 missing cavers close together in a passage known as Far Marathon. Sadly, all were lifeless, drowned by the torrent. The men likely never even had time to turn back. They were caught by floodwaters and overcome in seconds. Rescuers gently confirmed the identities and pressed onward, driven by a rumor of a possible survivor. One member of the trapped group, a man named John Ogden, was not immediately among the 5 bodies. Some speculated he might have been ahead and possibly found a high spot or an air bell to cling to. With desperate optimism, caving legend Bob Leakey, the very explorer who had first discovered Mossdale Caverns back in 1941, led a special search to find Ogden. Leakey navigated beyond where the others perished, squeezing into ever smaller rifts in search of a miracle. In one flooded section, rescuers built a small dam to lower water levels, risking their own lives as the dam strained under pressure. They pushed further into the silt-choked tunnels than anyone had gone, until finally, they found John Ogden's body as well. He had been swept into a tiny alcove, no airspace to be found. All 6 were accounted for. None had survived the flood. The decision was then made, painfully, to leave the bodies where they lay. The passages were so tight and remote that recovering the corpses would have endangered more lives. Over 300 volunteers had poured their sweat and tears into the rescue attempts across 4 long days. They were exhausted, many emotionally traumatized by the grim discovery in the depths. After consulting with the victims' families, the local coroner took the extraordinary step of declaring an inquest without retrieval of the bodies. The cave itself was to be sealed forever and declared a graveyard. On June 28, 1967, as a light rain fell, workers poured concrete down the Mossdale entrance, entombing the 6 men in the cold earth that had claimed them. Never has so much been done by so many people for such a small reward, concluded the official rescue report, encapsulating the heroic but heartbreaking effort. Fellow cavers bristled at the cave's closure. By nature, explorers hate to see a cave gated shut. But even the most ardent admitted Mossdale had exacted a terrible price. 4 days after the tragedy began, the volunteers packed their gear and wearily headed home, leaving Mossdale Caverns silent except for the drip of water in unseen chambers. In the aftermath, Mossdale's name became synonymous with caving's perils. A memorial plaque was affixed to the cliff above the now plugged entrance, inscribed with the names of the 6 lost young adventurers. On the moor above, a cairn of stones was erected directly above the spot in the cave where the bodies rest in perpetual darkness. The tragedy reverberated through the caving community. These were not reckless amateurs. They were skilled, disciplined explorers caught by nature's fury. Public reaction at the time was harsh. Many Britons saw it as a futile, senseless loss. Another bunch of loonies gambling their lives. Newspapers quoted skeptics, shaking their heads at the notion of crawling into such holes for no apparent gain. But fellow cavers understood that eternal drive to map the unknown. In the late 1960s, caving was a burgeoning sport for the bold, often the working-class youth seeking adventure beneath the green hills of Yorkshire. The Mossdale incident tempered that enthusiasm with a dose of mortal reality. It stood as Britain's worst caving accident, a grim record. For decades, Mossdale Caverns remained officially off-limits, a rare and extreme measure in Durisien Taranatius, and to this day, access is heavily restricted due to the site's history and ongoing danger of flooding. Years later, with permission from families, a team of Collins University peers quietly reopened the entrance against regulations and ventured in to perform a solemn duty. They gathered the remains of their 6 friends and laid them to rest in a dry chamber of the cave called Mud Caverns. It was 1971, and with this act, they symbolically buried their comrades properly, even if deep inside the mountain. The cave was resealed after that. Today, a visitor hiking near Mossdale Scar would see only the windswept limestone bluff and hear the gurgle of Mossdale Beck disappearing into the ground. A bronze plaque might catch your eye on the rock face weathered by decades of rain. It stands as a mute testament to the darkest day in British caving, reminding all who pass that beneath those peaceful hills, a labyrinth remembers the 6 who ventured too far on a day when the waters rose. In the annals of subterranean disasters, the Mossdale Cavern flood remains a sobering benchmark, a story of youthful ambition drowned in darkness, and of a rescue mission that became, tragically, a recovery. Memorial plaques affixed to the limestone cliff at Mossdale Scar mark the site of Britain's worst caving disaster. In 1967, 6 young men were trapped and drowned in the passages beneath this scar, turning the cave into their final resting place. The plaques serve as a haunting reminder on the moors, the only visible sign of the tragedy hidden in the depths below. Lost underwater, the Sterkfontein Cave. Dive tragedy. The Sterkfontein Caves in South Africa are renowned for their ancient fossils and cathedral-like chambers. But in October 1984, they earned a more tragic renown when a cave diver named Peter Verhulsel vanished into their flooded depths. What followed was a dreadful wait that stretched for weeks, as rescuers clung to the faint hope that he might somehow be alive in an air pocket deep inside the earth. Verhulsel's story is recounted in hushed tones by divers to this day, a cautionary tale of overconfidence and the unforgiving nature of submerged caves. It was a sunny spring day on September 29, 1984, when 29-year-old Peter Verhulsel and two friends geared up to dive an underground lake in the Sterkfontein cave system. These caves, part of the cradle of humankind, near Johannesburg, include both dry passages and water-filled tunnels. Although Verhulsel was an experienced open water diver, he was the least experienced of the trio in cave diving specifically. Perhaps eager to prove himself, he made a fateful mistake. Almost as soon as they descended, he let go of the guideline. In cave diving, a guideline, a rope running from the entrance, is your lifeline to exit. Rule number 1 is never lose hold of it. But Peter's curiosity got the better of him. Twice he strayed briefly to explore side passages and had to be fetched back to the safety line by his buddies. The third time, he disappeared completely into the maze of murky water and jagged tunnels and did not return. Imagine the scene in those initial moments. In the cold green murk of the subterranean lake, lit only by diver lamps, Verhulsel's two companions suddenly realized their friend was gone. Panic surged as they searched the silty water, hearts pounding. But Peter had vanished into a side tunnel, likely disoriented by zero visibility after stirring the mud. After exhausting their air supplies in a frantic but fruitless search, the pair had no choice but to surface and raise the alarm. Over the next hours and days, specialized cave divers mounted a search and rescue operation in Sterkfontein's flooded chambers. What they discovered gave a slim ray of hope. Deep in the lake, an underwater tunnel led to a small island of dry land, essentially a mudbank pocket in a hidden chamber. Could Verhulsel have found it? Divers following faint clues, a discarded dive reel, a silt trail, suspected he might have ended up in that very air chamber beyond the underwater tunnel. If so, he could be alive, breathing the stale air in a pitch-black cavern, marooned by water on all sides. It was a horrifying scenario to imagine. A diver surviving the initial mishap only to face a slow death alone in darkness, unless rescuers reached him in time. The challenge was enormous. The opening to the dry chamber was too tight to swim through with scuba gear, and approaching it stirred up clouds of silt that made visibility nearly zero. Volunteer teams from the Cave Rescue Organization and police units converged on Sterkfontein. They devised an audacious plan. Since diving in was near impossible, they would attempt a dry rescue by finding a back route from the surface. Using maps and intuition, they began digging from an adjacent cave passage toward the suspected chamber. Every weekend for 4 consecutive weeks, cavers toiled with crowbars and shovels to burrow a human-sized tunnel through dirt and rock toward where they believed Peter might be stranded. It was a race against time, and as the days turned into weeks, the outlook grew grim. Still, nobody was willing to abandon Peter to the abyss without giving it every possible effort. Inside the hidden chamber, as later evidence indicated, Peter Verhulsel endured an almost unimaginable ordeal. He had managed to surface onto the small island ledge in the dark, out of the water, alive, but utterly alone. His dive light likely gave out within hours, plunging him into total blackness. The temperature in Sterkfontein's depths hovers just above freezing, chilling him to the bone. He wore only a wetsuit, which provided scant warmth once he was stationary, and wet. For sustenance, he had nothing except the water dripping from stalactites, which he drank, keeping dehydration at bay. There was no food in that lightless vault, not even a strand of cave algae. The walls around him would have been slick limestone. The floor, cold mud. At one point, feeling the crushing despair of impending death, Peter scrawled a message in the sand of the cave floor for those he loved. With trembling fingers, he traced, "Love you, Shirl and Mom." Shirley was his young wife. He had married her only that July, less than 3 months earlier. This final missive, which searchers would later find, spoke volumes of his state of mind. Even as hope waned, he wanted to say goodbye. Back on the surface, a small media presence had gathered as word got out that a man was lost in Sterkfontein's caves. As days stretched on, headlines dubbed it, "A cave diver survives underground for weeks." Though no one could yet confirm if he still lived, families kept vigil. The psychological strain was heavy on the rescuers too. They knew each passing hour in that subterranean prison reduced Peter's odds. Finally, on November 5th, 1984, some 37 days after Peter went missing, the digging teams broke through into the chamber. They had tunneled about 20 meters from an adjacent passage to reach the isolated room. What they found was heartbreaking, if not unexpected. Peter Verhulsel's body, lying next to the inky pool, lifeless in the dark. An autopsy later determined he had survived approximately 3 weeks before finally succumbing to starvation and exposure. In other words, he likely perished mere hours or days before the rescuers' dig would have reached him. That gut-wrenching timing haunted everyone involved, to come so close, only to fail by a whisker. It's speculated that if he had held on perhaps another day or two, he might have heard the scrabble of rescuers breaking through. Instead, silence. Retrieving Peter's body was itself a challenging operation. The narrow tunnel the rescuers dug had to accommodate hauling a decomposed corpse out without causing further collapse. It took 6 hours for the team to carefully maneuver him through the 30-meter crawl passage they had excavated. When they emerged at last to daylight carrying the stretcher, a hush fell. It was the end everyone feared, but fought so hard to prevent. For South Africa's close-knit caving and diving community, the loss was a sobering lesson. Inquiries revealed that Verhulsel had dived with just a single oxygen tank and a single light, minimal equipment by safe cave diving standards. Moreover, he violated the golden rule by repeatedly letting go of the guideline, the thin cord that could have led to him back out. "We're all human, and we all make mistakes," veteran cave diver Martin Farr noted, using Peter's tragedy as a teaching moment. If even an experienced diver like Verhulsel could err fatally, no one was invincible in the subterranean realm. The Sterkfontein incident directly resulted in cave diving being banned in those caves thereafter. The authorities recognized that many passages remained unexplored and too dangerous. No more lives should be risked in their pursuit. To this day, visitors touring the Sterkfontein caves, usually on well-lit boardwalks viewing fossils, likely have no idea of the watery catacombs that branch off unseen, nor of the drama that unfolded there in 1984. But among cave divers, the story of Peter Verhulsel endures almost mythically. Divers speak of the terror he must have faced in that black void, rationing sips of water, listening in vain for a rescuing splash, hallucinating perhaps the voices of loved ones in the echo of dripping water. One cannot help but imagine him tracing that message to his wife and mother by the glow of a failing dive torch, his fingers pruny and trembling. It's a scene as eerie as any horror fiction, except it really happened. The perseverance of the rescue crews also stands out. They literally moved heaven and earth trying to reach him, week after week, demonstrating human solidarity even as nature cruelly ticked away Peter's last moments. In Sterkfontein's visitor center today, you won't find an exhibit about Peter Verhulsel, but ask a local caver or pick up an old newspaper archive, and the tale unfolds. How a 20-minute dive turned into a 3-week fight for survival in total darkness, and how that lost diver left behind a message of love written in sand. It's a stark reminder that beneath the tranquil hills of the Highveld, the underworld holds secrets, and some of them are tragedies carved in stone and water. Collapse at Cave Creek. On April 28, 1995, a group of enthusiastic college students ventured into the lush rainforest of New Zealand's west coast for what should have been a routine field trip, a visit to an area called Cave Creek in Paparoa National Park. They were part of an outdoor recreation course, young people passionate about nature and adventure. That day, their adventure was simply to admire a limestone chasm from a viewing platform built over the Cave Creek resurgence, where an underground stream emerges from the earth. It was supposed to be safe. The platform was a sanctioned overlook managed by the Department of Conservation, but at approximately 11:25 a.m., as 17 people stood on the wooden deck peering into the void below, the unthinkable happened. The entire platform suddenly sheared away from the cliff and plunged into the chasm. In an instant, joyous laughter turned to screams. The structure, along with everyone on it, free fell nearly 40 meters, 130 feet, into the rocky ravine. What awaited at the bottom was a jumble of boulders and rubble, unforgiving and lethal. The Cave Creek tragedy, as it came to be known, claimed 14 lives, most of them students barely out of their teens, and left 4 others grievously injured. The collapse was so sudden and absolute that survivors would later liken it to a trapdoor to hell opening beneath their feet. One of the survivors, 20-year-old Carolyn Kelly Smith, remembers everything about that fall. The morning had been beautiful, one of those crisp New Zealand autumn days with sunlight filtering through the canopy. From atop the platform, the view into the chasm was stunning, ferns clinging to limestone walls, the creek shining like a ribbon far below. Carolyn had just turned to walk off the platform when she felt it lurch. In her own words, "The platform started to slide as I walked away. I tried to grab at some flimsy trees, saplings near the edge, as I plummeted 30 meters. Those branches tore through her hands as she fell. She slammed onto the boulders at the bottom with bone-shattering force. The impact fractured her ankle, femur, and collarbone, and knocked the wind from her lungs. Around her, in the dim light of the chasm, she saw and heard the panic and agony of others, classmates and friends lying broken, some crying out, some ominously silent. 2 of her closest friends were fatally injured right before her eyes. They succumbed to their injuries in the interminable minutes before rescuers could arrive. Carolyn recalls the bitterly cold breeze that swept over those shattered lives and limbs as she waited, staring up at the distant rim of the chasm and the circle of sky above. Sunlight kissed her face only when rescuers finally lifted her out in a stretcher by rope hours later. She would later say that sunlight felt like a cruel taunt, highlighting the abyss from which she'd emerged, while so many of her friends would never see daylight again. The Cave Creek platform collapse was not a random act of nature, but a catastrophe of human error, a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen, triggered by shoddy construction and bureaucratic negligence. In the aftermath, a government commission of inquiry uncovered staggering failures in how the viewing platform had been designed and built. For starters, no engineer had ever approved the structure. It was knocked together in 1986 by Department of Conservation, DOC staff during a casual working bee, volunteer work day, without proper plans or oversight. Critical support joints were simply nailed, not bolted. The timber wasn't treated for outdoor use and had weakened over time. There were no foundations anchored to bedrock. The platform literally hung off the cliff by a few pieces of wood and nails driven into soft rock and soil. By 1995, after years of wet West Coast weather and heavy use, it was a ticking time bomb. Investigators found that the nails had finally corroded and torn loose, causing the whole deck to rip away under the weight of 18 people. One bereaved father summed it up in pain. It was quite simply a booby trap. The commission's report was scathing, blaming systemic failure within the Department of Conservation, a culture of lax oversight, poor communication, and disregard for safety regulations. Incredibly, despite the enormity of the loss and evidence of negligence, the judge ruled that no individual could be held legally responsible. It was the system that failed. This finding of diffused blame angered victims' families, who felt justice was denied even as they mourned their children. For survivors like Carolyn, who now prefers the name Kelly, believing her old self died that day, life would never be the same. Physically, she recovered from her broken bones, but the psychological wounds festered. She describes terrible mood swings, nightmares, and depression that haunted her in the years after. "All the time I wish I'd died that day. she confessed, struggling with survivor's guilt. Sleep brought little relief. Dreams replayed the moment of collapse in endless loops. The sudden give-way, the free fall, the sound of wood splintering and people screaming. She would wake up shouting and cursing, sometimes punching walls in her sleep. The once adventurous young woman could no longer enjoy the outdoors she loved. Before Cave Creek, I'd sit on the porch on a sunny morning and absolutely fall in love with the place every day. Now I look at it, and I just see hills, she said bleakly, the beauty now overshadowed by what happened in those hills. The trauma even led her to change her name, as mentioned. A poignant attempt to separate who she is now from who she was before the accident. Many others, families of the deceased, the 4 survivors, and even rescue personnel, similarly bore invisible scars from that day. Nationally, the Cave Creek disaster prompted a wave of reforms in New Zealand. The public was in shock that 13 promising students and 1 park worker could be killed so senselessly. It became a day of national mourning. Government agencies underwent a thorough overhaul of safety protocols. The Department of Conservation, in particular, implemented strict new procedures for the design and inspection of any structure on public land. The legacy, as one sister of a victim noted, is that we can all feel so much safer on DIOC structures and bridges now. A small consolation that perhaps other lives will be saved thanks to hard lessons learned. Indeed, everything from requiring proper engineering sign-off to installing signs warning of capacity limits to ensuring routine maintenance came out of the tragedy's inquiry. In a country known for outdoor recreation, it was a wake-up call that even seemingly safe activities can turn deadly if infrastructure is unsound. The memory of Cave Creek remains powerful decades later. On anniversaries, families and friends gather at memorial services to read the names of those who died. A memorial stone and plaque near the start of the Cave Creek track list the victims: 13 Tai Poutini Polytechnic students and 1 DOC Field Center manager. Nearby, native trees have been planted as living tributes. And at the Polytechnic campus in Greymouth, a memorial garden provides a quiet place for reflection. The site of the collapse itself is deep in the forest. Nature has reclaimed it. The wreckage was long ago removed, and a new, securely engineered platform now sits at a safer location for visitors to view the resurgence, with far fewer people allowed at once. But some who visit the place claim to feel an uncanny hush there, as if the forest itself remembers. One survivor remarked, "What a beautiful day it was, and how it turned suddenly very sad. An almost painful reminder of the fragility of life." The Cave Creek disaster now stands alongside names like Tanguai, Wahine, and Erebus in New Zealand's roll call of tragedies. Though smaller in death toll than those disasters, its impact on the national psyche and on public safety practices has been profound. It showed that danger doesn't only lurk deep in caves or in extreme adventures. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, under our very feet, in the things we take for granted as safe. 14 young lives were lost to a moment of structural failure, but their story has since ensured that countless other lives will never face the same fate, a legacy literally built on stronger foundations. The flash flood of Tam Nam Thalu. Under the emerald canopy of Thailand's Khao Sok National Park lies a cave system of stunning beauty and, as a group of unsuspecting tourists learned in October 2007, lethal danger. The cave is known as Tam Nam Thalu, often shortened to Nam Thalu, a limestone cavern famed for its subterranean waterfalls and colonies of bats. Guides typically lead visitors through its cool, darkness-shrouded passages as part of an eco-tour. But in the tropical monsoon season, Tam Nam Thalu can transform from a wonderland into a death trap in a matter of minutes. On October 13th, 2007, a flash flood roared through this cave without warning, engulfing a tour group inside. By the time the waters receded and rescuers could reach the scene, 8 people were dead. A Swiss family of 4, a 10-year-old German boy, 2 Thai guides, and a British man who died trying to save his fiancée. Only one person from the group survived to tell the tale, and her account is harrowing. One minute I was in what I thought was the most beautiful place in the world. The next thing there was death all around me, said 21-year-old Helena Carroll, the lone survivor. Helena and her fiancé, 24-year-old John Cullen, were adventurous backpackers from Solihull, England, on a year-long around-the-world trip. They had joined a guided excursion to Tamnam Thalu that day, blissfully unaware that heavy rain in the region had swollen streams. The group of tourists, which included John and Helena, a Swiss couple, Benno and Stalder Fischer, with their 2 teenage daughters, a young German boy named Eddie, and 2 local Thai guides, entered the cave after a scenic hike through the jungle. Armed with cheap torches provided by the guides, they walked and waded through the cave's inner chambers, marveling at spiders on the walls and bats fluttering overhead. Tamnam Thalu stretches about 500 meters into the mountain, and typically one must traverse waist-deep streams inside. The tourists likely had no idea that outside, upstream, a sudden cloudburst had unleashed torrential rain. Within the cave, their first hint of danger was a distant roar that quickly grew louder. Helena described hearing a sudden rush of water behind them, like a flash flood bearing down. I heard this sudden roar. I looked behind and saw this rush of water coming towards us, she recounted. In seconds, ankle-deep stream water turned into a churning surge. The guides shouted alarms. The tourists began scrambling for higher ground inside the cave as the floodwater advanced. John Cullen reacted immediately. He grabbed Helena as she slipped and almost got swept away, pulling her up onto a rocky ledge. In the frantic moments that followed, the couple witnessed scenes of horror illuminated by dancing flashlight beams. The first to be caught by the torrent were one of the Thai guides and the 10-year-old German boy. Helena saw them being dragged away by the muddy water, their screams echoing briefly before being cut off. Next, the wall of water slammed into the Swiss family. The parents and their 2 daughters were swept off their feet and disappeared into the darkness one by one. One can only imagine the panic. Parents trying in vain to hold on to their children as the current ripped them apart. Helena recalled them as the Swiss couple and their 2 lovely girls, emphasizing the human warmth now extinguished. John and Helena managed to climb higher, eventually finding a small alcove or ledge above the reach of the torrent. There they clung together, drenched, shivering, and enveloped in pitch black after their flashlight was lost. All around was the thunderous sound of rushing water. They were utterly alone, or so they believed, perched in darkness while the cave raged below. After some time, perhaps minutes, perhaps an hour, Helena lost all sense of time. The couple realized no other voices remained. They shouted but heard only the water's roar. In that desperate isolation, John made a fateful decision. He felt that if they stayed put, they might eventually be drowned or starve. Their best chance, he reasoned, was for him to try to ride the current out of the cave to get help. Helena disagreed vehemently. I said we should stay. At least we were safe there, she later recounted. But John feared the water could rise further and submerge even their ledge. Determined to save his fiancée, he told her he would go for help. He removed any excess gear, perhaps took a deep breath, and then lowered himself into the raging stream despite Helena's protests. He thought the current would take him out, she said. He slipped into the water. That's the last I ever saw of him. He let go and he was just gone. John was swept away in the blink of an eye, consumed by the darkness and flood. Now utterly alone, Helena remained on the ledge. She would cling there for an agonizing 16 hours in total darkness. She later described how she pressed herself against the craggy cave wall, trying to maintain a grip as water levels fluctuated and the rumble continued. Thoughts racing, she likely oscillated between hope and despair. At some point, the flood must have peaked and begun to subside, leaving her alive but stranded deep inside. Outside, a large-scale search and rescue was mobilized as soon as the alarm was raised. Park rangers and police knew that a group was trapped in Nam Thalu Cave by sudden flooding. Rescue teams were dispatched, battling the same jungle floods that had caused the disaster. By the early next morning, as waters receded enough to make an entry possible, rescuers carefully entered the cave searching for survivors. What they found first were bodies. Some washed out near the cave's mouth, others wedged in crevices inside. Then, incredibly, a flashlight beam fell upon a figure clinging to a high ledge. Helena, alive. She cried out weakly, and rescuers quickly helped her down and out of the cave to safety. At first, they spared her the full news, saying only that many people had died. Only later, at a makeshift morgue, did she learn the full truth. She was the sole survivor. As she walked among the rows of bodies and coffins, she found John's body. Heartbreakingly, it lay right next to the body of one of the teenage Swiss girls. John had indeed been carried out of the cave by the flood, but lifeless. The sight devastated Helena. "I can't believe my John is dead. I can't believe I am the only survivor," she sobbed. The tragedy drew international attention, not least because it involved foreign tourists. Thai authorities faced tough questions. Why were people in that cave during monsoon season at all? It quickly emerged that local tour operators normally avoided Tam Nam Thalu in the rainy months precisely due to flash flood risk. In fact, police had even erected warning signs and ordered the cave closed during rainy season. Yet somehow this particular excursion went ahead in mid-October, which is typically still the tail end of the monsoon. One operator said their company never runs tours to that cave in monsoon season. "We do not take tourists to Tam Nam Thalu in the rainy season at all," he emphasized. Helena and John, of course, were oblivious to any controversy. They trusted the guides who took them. In the aftermath, the province's governor openly stated he had now ordered the park closed during the rainy season. The implication was that perhaps enforcement had been lax before. Indeed, news surfaced that a Belgian tourist had been killed by a flood in the same cave a few years prior. If true, this meant the danger was known yet insufficiently heeded, a bitter pill for grieving families. Legal action was considered against those who led the ill-fated tour. But the ultimate resolution focused more on tightening safety rules and ensuring guides respect seasonal closures. For Helena Carroll, the lone survivor, the experience was life-altering in ways few can imagine. One day she was exploring a beautiful cave hand in hand with the man she loved. The next, she was on a plane home, escorting his coffin. "We decided to take a holiday instead of saving for a house. Up until then, it was a dream holiday in the most beautiful place I'd ever been," she reflected, voice cracking. Then, in a matter of minutes, that paradise turned into a nightmare. Her words, repeated in interviews: "One minute I was in a beautiful place, the next there was death all around me," have become an enduring epitaph of the Nam Thalu cave disaster. The cave itself remains indifferent to human tragedy, still and dark until the next rainy season, when nature will again send torrents through its chambers. But now at the trailheads and tour offices, warnings are prominently posted. The lesson has been painfully learned. Caves that appear benign can become deadly traps when water comes. Tourists are now kept out of Nam Thalu during any hint of rain, and guides, chastened by the memory of 2007, no longer gamble with monsoon weather. In Khao Sok National Park, if you speak with local rangers, they'll tell you the story of the Farang, foreign girl, who survived the cave flood and how her fiancé heroically saved her, only to lose his own life. They speak of it with a mix of sorrow and respect, a cautionary tale to never underestimate the wrath of nature underground. A sunny jungle trek can conceal a fatal hazard, and in the darkness of Tam Nam Thalu, 8 lives were the price of that lesson. Nutty Putty Cave. John Edward Jones loved exploring caves. It was practically in his blood. He had been spelunking with his family since childhood, crawling through Utah's underground mazes as a young Boy Scout. Now 26 years old, married with a baby daughter and another child on the way, John was home for Thanksgiving and decided to rekindle that old hobby with a casual caving trip. On the evening of November 24th, 2009, John, along with his brother Josh and some friends, entered Nutty Putty Cave, a popular spelunking spot outside Alberta, Utah. Nutty Putty was a well-known beginner cave, a maze of cramped crawlways and a few larger rooms famous, or infamous, for its squeezes with nicknames like the Birth Canal, the Scout Eater, and the Helmet Eater. Thousands had visited it over the years, sometimes a bit too casually. In fact, Nutty Putty had seen multiple stuck caver incidents before. From 1999 to 2004, at least 6 people got wedged in tight passages and had to be rescued. Authorities even closed the cave for a time due to safety concerns, only reopening it in mid-2009 with a stricter permit system. So, as John Jones wriggled into Nutty Putty that night, he likely felt confident, perhaps even a touch invincible. He'd done this many times, but Nutty Putty had one more horrific incident in store, one that would become one of America's most haunting caving tragedies. By all accounts, John was a tall but slim man, 6 feet tall, about 200 pounds, and well built for many caves. But Nutty Putty's most challenging corkscrew passages push even the leanest bodies to their limits. At some point during their exploration, John decided to attempt a tight, downward-sloping passage that he believed might lead to a larger chamber. Some reports suggest he thought he'd found the notorious Birth Canal passage and hoped it opened up beyond. In reality, he likely entered an uncharted fissure, a dead-end crevice with no exit, later sometimes called Ed's Push by rescuers. Around 9 p.m., as John wriggled headfirst into this tight chute, he became irreversibly stuck. The passage was less than 10 inches across and angled downward at about 70 degrees. John slid in until his torso was trapped and his hips snagged on a lip of rock, one arm pinned underneath him. He was essentially upside down, his head sloping toward a perpendicular crack, his feet above, awkwardly protruding behind him. Instantly, panic set in as he realized he couldn't go forward or backward. The narrow walls gripped his chest. Gravity pulled his body deeper with every breath. He was stuck, upside down, over 100 feet from the surface, in a space barely wider than the diameter of a dinner plate. His brother Josh was the first to find him. Unable to pull John out, Josh quickly scrambled from the cave to call for help. Thus began a desperate rescue operation that unfolded over the next 27 hours and captured wide attention. Experienced cavers and search and rescue teams poured in, totaling 137 volunteers in the effort. The scene was chaotic and tense. Family members huddled at the cave entrance, rescue commanders coordinating gear and personnel in the cold November night, and deep inside, a handful of brave rescuers crawling one by one into the cramped tunnel where John remained trapped. Only those slight of build could even reach him. The tunnel was so constricted that out of all the rescuers, only about 6 people ever managed to get all the way to John's position during the ordeal. One of them was a skinny caver named Ryan Schertz, who arrived after John had already been inverted for nearly 12 hours. What Ryan saw made him fight back tears. John's body wedged in an 8.5-inch crevice, nearly vertical, with only his lower legs and feet sticking out of a crack in the rock. The geometry looked impossible. How could they ever pull a 6-foot, 200-pound man back up through that? Rescuers knew that simply yanking him out by brute force risked breaking his legs or worse. Meanwhile, the clock on John's survival was ticking. Being upside down for a prolonged period is extremely dangerous. The human body is not built to handle blood pooling in the head and lungs. Over time, it leads to suffocation and cardiac stress. Already, John was experiencing difficulty breathing, and his speech would sometimes slur as blood pressure fluctuated. Yet through it all, John remained remarkably lucid at times, even polite and apologetic. "I'm sorry I'm so fat," he joked at one point to rescuer Ryan. "It would be so much easier for you guys to get me out if I wasn't so fat." In truth, his size wasn't abnormal. It was the cave that was terribly small. Ryan tried to keep his spirits up. "Well, when we get you out of here, I'll be your workout buddy," he replied, managing a smile. The rescuers developed a plan. They would rig a complex pulley system anchored to the cave walls to try to haul John out inch by inch. Early attempts to use climbing cams for anchors failed. The cams slipped out of the soft, powdery calcite that coated the tunnel, so they drilled bolts directly into the rock, creating a series of 15 pulley points along the tunnel. It was an engineering feat, turning that cramped space into something like a vertical mine rescue shaft. As this construction went on, with power drills reverberating through the cave, other rescuers tended to John. They gave him sips of Gatorade through a long tube to keep him hydrated. They talked to him about his family to keep him calm. He spoke lovingly of his wife, Emily, and their 13-month-old daughter, and how Emily was expecting their second child in a few months. When John would start to drift into panic or lose touch with reality, at one point he deliriously asked, "Why did you guys put me here?" Not comprehending that he had crawled in. Rescuers refocused him by asking about happy memories and his plans for the future. Particularly poignant was when they managed to set up a field telephone line down to his tunnel. His wife Emily, waiting anxiously above, was able to speak to him. "I love you. Just keep fighting." Her voice crackled over the speaker in the darkness. Hearing her, John yelled back, "I love you. Tell Lizzie or their daughter, I love her. I'll get out and I'll come see you." The cave rescuer holding the phone, a hardened volunteer, had tears streaming down his face as he extended the little box as far as his arm could reach towards John. By 4 p.m. on November 25th, 19 hours into the ordeal, the pulley system was finally ready. The narrow tunnel was a hive of quiet, focused activity, as 8 rescuers stationed in various spots prepared to heave together in a coordinated effort. The plan: inch John upward, then have Ryan, who stayed head-to-head with John in the crevice, reposition him slightly to navigate a tricky bend, and continue in stages. At first, it worked. They managed to lift John's body a few critical inches, enough for him to see Ryan's face for the first time. "It sucks, I'm upside down. I can't believe I'm upside down," John said, managing a grin. "My legs are killing me." Despite everything, he was conscious and even able to crack a wry smile. They let him rest, then tried again, gaining a bit more. After about the third haul, John's legs cleared a tight spot and hope soared among the rescuers. He was moving, at last. Then came disaster. Without warning, a crucial pulley anchor failed. The rock feature used as the top anchor, a natural arch in the tunnel ceiling Edino Trau Sintateu, suddenly broke under the strain. The entire pulley line snapped loose. A heavy metal carabiner recoiled like a projectile, striking Ryan in the face and cutting his forehead and tongue badly. More horrifyingly, John, who had been partially lifted out of his tight spot, slid back down. When tension was lost, he fell back into the exact narrow crevice that had held him all along, possibly even a bit deeper now. The sudden motion and inverted drop must have been excruciating. Ryan, dazed from the blow and bleeding, shouted in anguish, not for his own injury, but because he saw their progress erased. The rescuers regrouped, but this setback was dire. In the tight tunnel, installing a new anchor or pulley would take time and new engineering. And time was one thing John did not have in abundance. By now, John had been upside down for over 22 hours. His heart was struggling. He had trouble breathing as his organs pressed on his diaphragm, and the blood pooled dangerously. He became increasingly unresponsive, slipping into a stupor. Ryan, injured and exhausted, had to be helped out of the tunnel. Another rescuer took his place to monitor John. They tried to speak to him to get any response. At approximately 11:45 p.m. on November 25th, John went quiet. A medical technician present managed to squeeze in and check for vital signs. There was no pulse. John Edward Jones was pronounced dead of probable cardiac arrest due to the strain on his inverted body. In that awful moment, the hundreds of rescuers and family members outside felt the weight of crushing defeat. They had given everything: sweat, blood, literally, and tears. But Nutty Putty Cave had won. In the early hours of Thanksgiving morning, officials faced a grim task: informing John's family not only that he had died, but that his body could not be recovered. Removing him after death would be even harder than the rescue attempt. His lifeless body would not assist by wriggling or pushing, and the narrow corkscrew he was stuck in made a recovery operation dangerously risky for rescuers. With heavy hearts, the family agreed that no further lives should be put in danger to retrieve John. The cave would be his final resting place, sealed as a tomb both out of respect and to prevent any future accident there. On Thanksgiving Day 2009, authorities filled the main entrance of Nutty Putty Cave with concrete, permanently closing it. John's wife, Emily, grief-stricken, suddenly had no gravesite to visit, only the knowledge that her husband's body lay deep in a dark hole under a hill in Utah. John loved the outdoors. He loves Utah. He loves wide open space. Emily later reflected, "It's so fitting that it's his spot now." With remarkable grace, she found some solace in believing John's spirit was at peace, watching over their family. She even named their newborn son, born a few weeks after the tragedy, John, ensuring the memory of a father he would never meet lived on. For the volunteer rescuers who fought to save John, the outcome was deeply traumatic. Many struggled with guilt and PTSD. They had been so close. "We were actually talking with him. This one is very tender. Still, it's an open wound," said one veteran rescuer, noting how personal this failed rescue felt. Some combed over every decision, every hour of the operation, wondering if they could have done something different. But the consensus was that John's predicament was nearly inescapable from the start. The passage was simply too tight at too bad an angle. Seasoned cavers noted a harsh truth. John had made a fundamental mistake by going headfirst downward into an unknown narrow passage. As cavers, that's one of the things we're taught not to do, one expert said later. Had he been oriented the other way, feet first, it's my opinion, he would have gotten out. This tragic error in judgment, an understandable one for an excited hobbyist exploring with family, proved fatal. The Nutty Putty Cave incident, widely publicized, became a modern cautionary tale about the real dangers of caving. It's not just deep, elaborate caves that pose risks. Sometimes it's the unassuming, crawly little caves, where complacency can be deadly. Nutty Putty was closed permanently, effectively becoming John's grave, and it remains sealed to this day under that hill. A plaque outside pays tribute to his life and bravery. His story has since been told in documentaries, news articles, and even a feature film, The Last Descent. People around the world shudder at the thought of being stuck upside down in a narrow rock tube, calling it one of the most horrifying deaths imaginable. And yet, amidst the horror of the Nutty Putty tragedy, there is also the memory of John Jones as a real person, a devoted husband, father, brother, and friend. His last words were of love for his family, and he demonstrated incredible courage and faith in his final hours. In recalling this event, we do not just dwell on the eerie, claustrophobic details. We also remember the humanity that shone in that dark hole. The rescuers comforting a stranger as a brother, the wife's voice carried through a wire to speak love into the darkness, and a man's unwavering will to fight for life until his body simply could take no more. These 5 disasters, the tragedy of Floyd Collins in Sand Cave, the flash flood at Mossdale Caverns, the slow demise of Peter Verhulsel in Sterkfontein, the collapse at Cave Creek, the flash flood of Tamnum Thalu, and the entrapment of John Jones in Nutty Putty, each stand as stark reminders of the perils that lurk beneath our feet. In caves, beauty and danger are 2 sides of the same coin. The eerie atmospheres of these underground realms can turn from enchanting to deadly in a heartbeat, whether by water, rock, or the confines of the earth itself. What draws people into these depths is the human spirit of exploration and challenge, the same spirit that, tragically, sometimes leads them to harm. Yet in each story, we also find tales of heroism, camaraderie, and love in the face of doom. The rescuers who refused to quit, the friends who risked, and sometimes lost, their lives for each other, the families who forged meaning out of unspeakable loss. These events are rooted firmly in fact, etched into the historical record, but they read almost like dark fables or cautionary myths. The next time you peer into a cave's mouth, remember these stories. Feel the cool air exhale from the darkness. Recall Floyd Collins singing in the dark to keep fear at bay, or Helena Carroll clinging to a Thai cave wall through the night, or John Jones murmuring a prayer upside down in the bowels of the earth. These subterranean tragedies, however eerie and compelling, are not just stories. They were lived by real people. The caves keep their secrets in the silence now, but we who walk on the surface carry the memory of those lost beneath. Every drip of water echoing in a cavern, every whisper of wind through a cave entrance may remind us that the underworld is beautiful, yes, but it can also be ruthless, and it always demands respect. I'm Phantom Astronaut, and I'll see you out there.